The rain hammered against the windshield of Mark's pickup truck as he drove through the winding mountain road. His 8-year-old son Tommy sat in the passenger seat, sketching in his notebook despite the bumpy ride. It was their monthly weekend. Together, a tradition Mark had fought hard to maintain after his divorce 2 years ago. The custody battle had been brutal, but these precious hours with Tommy made every legal fee worth it. Mark worked double shifts at the construction site to afford his small apartment and the child support payments. His hands were permanently stained with concrete dust and his back ached constantly, but he never complained when Tommy was around. The boy needed stability, something Mark was determined to provide despite his own struggles. "Dad, look at this drawing," Tommy said, holding up his notebook. He had sketched a house with a big yard and 2 stick figures standing in front. "That's us when I come to live with you full-time." Mark's heart squeezed. Tommy's mother had primary custody, and the visits were limited to every other weekend and Wednesday evenings. The boy had been asking when he could stay with his father permanently, but Mark knew the legal system rarely favored working-class single fathers, especially ones living in cramped apartments. "It's beautiful, buddy," Mark replied, glancing at the drawing. "Maybe someday we'll have that house." The storm was getting worse. Weather reports had warned of flash floods in the area, but Mark had driven this route dozens of times. He knew every curve and pothole. What he didn't know was that the heavy rains had loosened the soil on the hillside above them. Tommy had fallen asleep by the time they reached the steepest part of the mountain pass. Mark turned down the radio and drove more carefully, his eyes straining to see through the downpour. The headlights barely cut through the darkness, and the wipers could hardly keep up with the rain. Then he heard it, a deep, rumbling sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once. At first, Mark thought it was thunder, but the sound kept growing louder. He slowed the truck and looked up at the hillside. Through the rain, he could see something massive moving in the darkness. The landslide hit them before Mark could react. Tons of mud, rocks, and debris crashed down onto the road, sweeping the pickup truck off the asphalt like a toy. Mark felt the world spinning as the vehicle tumbled down the embankment. He reached over to protect Tommy, but everything went black. When Mark regained consciousness, he was hanging upside down, held in place by his seatbelt. His head throbbed, and warm blood trickled down his forehead. The truck had rolled several times before coming to rest against a cluster of pine trees. Rain was still pouring through the shattered windshield. "Tommy!" Mark called out, panic rising in his chest. His son was unconscious, his small body limp in the passenger seat. Blood stained the boy's hair, and his breathing was shallow but steady. Mark's hands shook as he checked for a pulse. It was weak, but there. The truck was buried partially under mud and debris. Mark tried his cell phone, but there was no signal. The radio was dead, and the engine wouldn't start. They were trapped in a remote area where few people traveled, especially in weather like this. The rescue teams wouldn't even know they were missing until Mark failed to return Tommy on Sunday evening. Mark managed to unbuckle himself and crawl over to Tommy. The boy's left arm appeared to be broken, and there was a nasty gash on his head. Mark tore strips from his shirt to bandage the wound, his construction worker instincts kicking in. He had basic first aid training from the job site, and he used every bit of knowledge he had. "Stay with me, son," Mark whispered, cradling Tommy's head. "We're going to get out of this." But as the hours passed, Mark began to lose hope. The rain continued to fall, and water was slowly seeping into the truck. Tommy drifted in and out of consciousness, mumbling incoherently. Mark knew his son needed medical attention soon, or the head injury could become life-threatening. Dawn brought no relief. The storm had passed, but Mark could see they were completely cut off from the road. The landslide had created a wall of debris 20 feet high. Even if he could climb out of the truck, he couldn't leave Tommy alone, and carrying an injured child up that slope would be impossible. Mark had never been a religious man, but as he held his unconscious son, he found himself praying to anyone who might be listening. He promised to be a better father, to fight harder for custody, to never take these moments for granted again. Tommy was his entire world, the only good thing that had come from his failed marriage. On the second day, Tommy's condition worsened. His fever spiked, and he barely responded when Mark spoke to him. The makeshift bandages were soaked with blood, and Mark had no medical supplies beyond what he could improvise. He rationed the single bottle of water he found in the truck's glove compartment, giving most of it to Tommy. Mark's own injuries were taking their toll. His ribs were likely cracked and his left shoulder was dislocated. But physical pain meant nothing compared to watching his son slip away. He told Tommy stories about their fishing trips, sang the silly songs they used to make up together, and read from the boy's notebook of drawings. "Remember when we built that treehouse?" Mark said, his voice hoarse. "You said it was going to be our secret headquarters. You made me promise that no girls were allowed, not even your mom." He laughed despite the tears streaming down his face. "We're going to build another one, buddy. A bigger one with a rope swing and everything." As the second night fell, Mark heard something that made his heart race. It sounded like voices in the distance. But he had been hallucinating from exhaustion and dehydration. He called out anyway, screaming until his throat was raw. The voices faded and silence returned. Mark pulled Tommy closer and closed his eyes. If they were going to die here, at least they would be together. He had failed at marriage, struggled with money and lived in a crummy apartment, but he had never stopped loving his son. That had to count for something. The sound that woke Mark on the third morning wasn't thunder or falling rocks. It was a dog barking. He lifted his head carefully, every muscle in his body screaming in protest. Tommy was still breathing, but his skin had taken on a grayish pallor. That terrified Mark. The boy needed help immediately. The barking continued, sometimes close, sometimes distant. Mark gathered what little strength he had left and began honking the truck's horn. The battery was almost dead, but the horn still worked. He pressed it in patterns. 3 short, 3 long, 3 short. The universal distress signal he remembered from his military service years ago. After what felt like hours, Mark heard human voices again. This time, they were real. A man's voice called out from somewhere above them, asking if anyone was down there. Mark screamed back with everything he had left, his voice cracking from thirst and exhaustion. "We're here. My son needs help." The rescue took another 4 hours. The search and rescue team had to carefully remove debris while making sure the hillside wouldn't collapse further. Mark watched helplessly as paramedics rappelled down to assess Tommy's condition. The lead medic, a woman named Sarah, immediately started an IV and radioed for an emergency helicopter. "Your boy's a fighter," Sarah told Mark as they prepared to lift Tommy out first. "You did good keeping him stable down here." Mark wanted to go with his son, but the helicopter could only take one patient at a time. He watched the aircraft disappear over the mountain ridge, carrying the most precious thing in his world. The ground rescue team helped Mark climb out of the wreckage, and an ambulance rushed him to the same hospital where Tommy was being treated. The next few days passed in a blur of medical procedures and worried waiting. Tommy remained unconscious, while doctors worked to reduce the swelling in his brain. Mark sat by his bedside despite his own injuries. 3 broken ribs, a dislocated shoulder, and a concussion. The nurses kept trying to make him rest in his own room, but he refused to leave Tommy's side. Mark's ex-wife Linda arrived on the 4th day. She looked exhausted and frightened, her usual perfect appearance replaced by wrinkled clothes and no makeup. Despite their bitter divorce, she hugged Mark tightly when she saw him in the hospital corridor. "The police told me what happened," Linda said, tears streaming down her face. "They said you kept him alive for 3 days with almost nothing." Mark nodded, unable to speak. He had been dreading this moment, knowing Linda would blame him for taking Tommy on a dangerous mountain road during a storm. But instead of anger, he saw only gratitude in her eyes. "I've been such a fool," Linda continued, "fighting you for custody, limiting your time with him. Tommy talks about you constantly. He draws pictures of you two together every day." They sat together in the hospital waiting room, 2 parents united by their love for their son and their fear of losing him. Linda told Mark how Tommy had been struggling in school, getting into fights and refusing to talk about his feelings. The divorce had been harder on him than either parent had realized. "He keeps asking when he can live with Daddy full-time," Linda admitted. "I thought he was just being dramatic, but maybe he was trying to tell us something." On the 6th day, Tommy opened his eyes. His first word was "Daddy," and Mark broke down completely. The boy was weak and confused, but he was alive and aware. The doctor said it would be a long recovery, but Tommy would make a full recovery with time and physical therapy. As Tommy grew stronger, Mark noticed something different about his relationship with Linda. They began talking more openly than they had in years. The near loss of their son had stripped away the petty resentments and legal battles that had defined their post-divorce relationship. "I want to change the custody arrangement," Linda told Mark one evening as they sat in Tommy's hospital room. Their son was sleeping peacefully, his color finally returning to normal. "Tommy should spend equal time with both of us. I was wrong to try to limit your relationship with him." Mark was stunned. He had been preparing for another court battle, expecting Linda to argue that his poor judgment had put Tommy in danger. Instead, she was offering him exactly what he had been fighting for. During Tommy's recovery, Mark learned more about the rescue that had saved their lives. The search team had almost given up hope when a golden retriever named Max had led them to the crash site. The dog belonged to a local family and had somehow broken free during the storm to help find them. Mark visited Max and his owners, the Patterson family, who lived in a farmhouse about 5 miles from where the landslide had occurred. They were an older couple, retired teachers who had moved to the mountains for peace and quiet. Max was their constant companion, but they had never seen him behave the way he did during the rescue. "That dog was determined to lead those searchers to you," Mrs. Patterson explained. "He kept running back and forth between our house and the road, barking and whining. When the rescue team arrived, he practically dragged them to where you were." Mark knelt down to pet Max, who seemed to remember him. The dog's tail wagged furiously as he licked Mark's face. There was something special about this animal, something that went beyond normal canine behavior. "He's been restless ever since the rescue," Mr. Patterson added, "like he's waiting for something." Mark didn't think much about it at the time. He was focused on Tommy's recovery and the unexpected improvement in his relationship with Linda. They had begun co-parenting like actual partners instead of enemies, making decisions together about Tommy's medical care and therapy schedule. Tommy was released from the hospital after 2 weeks, but he would need months of physical therapy to regain full use of his left arm. The head injury had healed remarkably well, though he would need regular checkups to monitor for any long-term effects. The first night Tommy spent at Mark's apartment after the accident, the boy seemed different, more mature somehow, as if the experience had aged him beyond his 8 years. He talked about the accident calmly, remembering fragments of their time trapped in the truck. "I wasn't scared, Daddy," Tommy said as Mark tucked him into bed. "I knew you would take care of me." Mark's throat tightened with emotion. His son's faith in him was both humbling and terrifying. The accident had shown Mark just how precious and fragile life could be, and how quickly everything could change. 2 months after the accident, Mark received an unexpected phone call that would change everything. Mrs. Patterson's voice was shaky when she called, and Mark could hear Mr. Patterson crying in the background. "Mark, I'm sorry to bother you, but something's happened with Max," she said. "He's been diagnosed with cancer. The vet says he only has a few weeks left." Mark felt like someone had punched him in the stomach. The dog who had saved their lives was dying, and there was nothing anyone could do about it. He asked if he could bring Tommy to visit Max, and the Pattersons eagerly agreed. When they arrived at the farmhouse the next day, Max was noticeably thinner but still managed to wag his tail when he saw them. Tommy immediately sat on the floor and gently hugged the golden retriever, whispering "thank you" over and over again. "Max saved our lives," Tommy told the Pattersons seriously. "He's a hero dog." During their visit, Mark learned more about the elderly couple's situation. They had no children of their own, and Max had been their constant companion for 9 years. With the dog's illness progressing rapidly, they were devastated at the thought of being alone on the isolated farm. "We've been talking about selling this place," Mr. Patterson confided to Mark while Tommy played with Max in the yard. "It's getting too much for us to handle, and without Max it'll be too quiet." Mark looked around the property with new eyes. The farmhouse was old but well maintained, sitting on 20 acres of beautiful mountain land. There was a large workshop that would be perfect for his construction tools, and plenty of space for Tommy to run and play. Most importantly, it was the place where their guardian angel lived. "How much are you asking for it?" Mark found himself saying. The Pattersons looked surprised. They hadn't formally put it on the market yet, but they named a price that was actually within Mark's reach. If he used his savings and got a mortgage, it was less than he had expected for such a large property. "We're not looking to make a profit," Mrs. Patterson explained. "We just want to know the place will be loved by the right family." That evening, Mark discussed the possibility with Linda and Tommy. His ex-wife was surprisingly supportive of the idea, especially when she learned it was the same property where Max lived. "Tommy talks about that dog constantly," Linda said. "And you're right that the mountain air might be good for his recovery. Plus, you'd have room for him to stay whenever he wants." Tommy was ecstatic about the possibility of living near Max, even though they all knew the dog didn't have long left. The boys seemed to understand that Max needed them as much as they needed him. The paperwork moved quickly. Mark's construction experience helped him get a good mortgage rate, and the Pattersons were eager to finalize the sale. They planned to move to a retirement community closer to town, but they asked if they could visit Max regularly until the end. Mark and Tommy moved to the farmhouse just 3 weeks later. Linda helped with the move, and for the first time since their divorce, they worked together like a real family. Tommy's room had windows facing the mountains, and he could see Max's favorite spot, under an old oak tree, from his bed. Max seemed to gain energy from having Tommy around. The dog would follow the boy everywhere, slowly but determinedly. Tommy read to Max every evening, and the dog would rest his head on the boy's lap, seeming to listen to every word. "It's like Max is teaching him something," Linda observed one evening as they watched Tommy and the dog together. "Tommy's been so much calmer since we moved here." Mark had noticed it too. His son, who had been struggling with nightmares and anxiety after the accident, seemed more peaceful on the farm. The boy talked about his feelings more openly and had started drawing again, filling notebooks with pictures of the mountains, the farmhouse, and Max. One morning, Mark found Tommy sitting by Max's bed in the kitchen, gently stroking the dog's fur. Max was breathing heavily, and Mark could tell the end was near. "Is Max going to die today, Daddy?" Tommy asked without looking up. Mark sat down beside his son, not sure how to answer. They had talked about death before, but this was different. This was about losing someone who had saved their lives. "I think so, buddy," Mark said softly. "Max is very sick and his body is tired." Tommy nodded solemnly. "He's not scared, though. I can tell." They called the Pattersons, who rushed over to say goodbye. The old couple sat with Max for hours, sharing memories and thanking him for being such a wonderful companion. As the sun began to set, Max took his last breath with his head resting on Tommy's lap. The funeral they held for Max was simple but meaningful. They buried him under his favorite oak tree, and Tommy placed a drawing he had made of Max wearing a superhero cape over the grave. Linda stayed for the service, and even she cried as they said their final goodbyes to the dog who had brought them all together. In the weeks following Max's death, something unexpected began happening around the farmhouse. Other animals started showing up on their property. Injured birds, lost cats, and even a young deer with a hurt leg. It was as if word had spread through the animal kingdom that this was a safe place. Tommy seemed to have a natural gift for caring for these creatures. He would sit quietly with injured animals, speaking to them in soft tones until they calmed down. Mark was amazed at his son's patience and gentle touch with the wounded animals. "Maybe Max sent them here," Tommy suggested one day as they released a healed rabbit back into the wild. "Maybe he wants us to help other animals like he helped us." Mark began researching wildlife rehabilitation and discovered there was a real need for licensed facilities in their area. The nearest wildlife center was over 100 miles away, meaning many injured animals couldn't get the help they needed in time. Linda was initially skeptical when Mark told her about his idea to start an animal rescue operation on the farm. But when she saw how passionate Tommy was about helping the animals and how much the work was helping his own healing process, she began to support the plan. "Tommy's found his calling," she admitted to Mark one evening. "I've never seen him so focused and happy." Mark began the process of getting licensed as a wildlife rehabilitator. It would take months of training and inspections, but he was determined to make it work. The construction skills he had developed over the years would be useful for building proper enclosures and medical facilities. As winter approached, their little family had found a new rhythm. Tommy split his time between both parents' homes, but the farmhouse had become the center of their world. Linda had even started spending nights there when Tommy was with Mark, helping with the growing number of animals in their care. The accident that had nearly destroyed their family had somehow brought them back together, not as husband and wife, but as partners in raising their son and caring for creatures that needed their help. Max's legacy lived on in every animal they saved and every moment they spent together as a family. Spring brought new challenges and unexpected joy to the farmhouse. Mark had completed his wildlife rehabilitation training and received his license just as baby animal season began in earnest. Their first official patients were 3 orphaned raccoon kits found by a local hiker. Tommy was in his element, helping Mark prepare formula bottles and cleaning the small enclosures they had built in the converted barn. Linda found herself staying at the farmhouse more often, drawn in by her son's enthusiasm and Mark's dedication to their mission. "I never thought I'd be bottle-feeding baby raccoons at 6 in the morning," Linda laughed as she helped with them, dawn feeding. She had taken a leave of absence from her job as a bank manager to help with Tommy's continued recovery and the growing animal sanctuary. The transformation in their family dynamics was remarkable. Where once there had been tension and legal battles, now there was cooperation and shared purpose. Tommy thrived in the environment, his confidence growing with each animal they successfully released back to the wild. Mark had converted part of the barn into a proper veterinary clinic with help from Dr. Sarah Martinez, the local wildlife veterinarian, who had become their mentor. Dr. Martinez was impressed with their setup and Tommy's natural ability with the animals. "That boy has a gift," she told Mark after watching Tommy calm a frightened fox kit. "He seems to understand what they need without even thinking about it." Word about their sanctuary spread through the community, and they began receiving calls from people who had found injured or orphaned wildlife. The Pattersons visited regularly, bringing donations of supplies and helping with fundraising efforts. They had found new purpose in supporting the sanctuary that had grown from Max's legacy. One evening in late spring, Linda made an announcement that surprised everyone. "I've been thinking about moving back," she said during dinner. "Not moving back in with Mark," she added quickly, "but buying a house nearby. I want to be closer to Tommy and help with the sanctuary full-time." Tommy's face lit up. "Really, Mom? You'd live near us?" Linda nodded. "There's a small house for sale just down the road. I could walk here every morning to help with the animals, and you could go back and forth between both homes easily." Mark felt a mix of emotions. Having Linda nearby would be wonderful for Tommy, and her help with the sanctuary was invaluable. But he worried about old feelings resurfacing and complicating their newly peaceful relationship. "Are you sure about this?" Mark asked Linda privately later that evening. "It's a big change from your life in town." Linda looked out at the mountains, where Tommy was sitting by Max's grave telling the departed dog about their latest rescues. "Look at him, Mark. Our son is happy here in a way I've never seen before, and honestly, I'm happy here too. For the first time since our divorce, I feel like I'm part of something meaningful." The house Linda wanted was a small cottage that had belonged to an elderly artist who had passed away the previous winter. It needed work, but Mark's construction skills made the repairs manageable. More importantly, it was close enough for Tommy to easily walk between both homes while still giving everyone their own space. As summer approached, their sanctuary was thriving. They had successfully raised and released dozens of animals, from tiny hummingbirds to young deer. Tommy kept a journal with drawings and notes about each animal they helped, creating a detailed record of their work. The most challenging case came in July, when a local farmer called about an injured mountain lion kitten. The mother had been killed by a car, leaving the 3-month-old cub alone and frightened. Mountain lions were dangerous predators that required special permits and facilities to rehabilitate. "We're not equipped for something like this," Mark told Dr. Martinez when she called to discuss the case. "A mountain lion needs specialized care." The nearest facility that can handle big cats is in Colorado, Dr. Martinez replied. That's a 10-hour drive, and this kitten is in critical condition. I don't think it would survive the transport. Tommy overheard the conversation and immediately wanted to help. We have to try, Dad. We can't just let it die because it's too hard. Against his better judgment, Mark agreed to take the mountain lion kitten temporarily while they figured out a long-term solution. They set up a secure enclosure in the barn's isolation area, following strict safety protocols. The kitten, which Tommy named Luna, was severely dehydrated and malnourished. For the first week, it was touch and go whether she would survive at all. Tommy spent hours sitting outside her enclosure, talking softly to the frightened animal. Linda was initially terrified of having a predator on the property, but she couldn't argue with the results. Under Tommy's patient care and Dr. Martinez's medical treatment, Luna began to recover. The kitten seemed to respond specifically to Tommy's presence, calming down whenever the boy was near. This is different from the other animals, Linda observed one evening as they watched Tommy read to Luna through the fence. She's bonding with him in a way that might not be healthy for either of them. Mark knew Linda was right. Mountain lions were not pets, and Luna would eventually need to be either released into the wild or transferred to a facility that could provide lifetime care. But watching Tommy's face light up when Luna played with the enrichment toys they provided, Mark couldn't bring himself to make that call yet. The solution came from an unexpected source. A wildlife sanctuary in Montana heard about their situation and offered to take Luna once she was old enough for transport. They specialized in big cats and had successfully released several mountain lions back into appropriate habitats. She'll be well cared for, the sanctuary director assured Mark during their phone conversation, and if she can't be released, she'll have a permanent home with us where she can live as naturally as possible. Tommy took the news hard. He had known this day would come, but forming a bond with Luna had been inevitable. The night before Luna was scheduled to leave, Tommy spent extra time with her, explaining through tears that she needed to go somewhere she could be truly free. I'll miss you, Tommy whispered to Luna, who seemed to sense the boy's distress. But you're going to have a better life where you can run and hunt and be a real mountain lion. The transport went smoothly, and Luna's new caretakers sent regular updates about her progress. She was eventually released into a protected wilderness area in Montana, where GPS tracking showed she was thriving in her natural habitat. Tommy was sad for weeks after Luna left, but he threw himself into caring for their other animals with renewed determination. He had learned an important lesson about loving something enough to let it go, a lesson that would serve him well in the years ahead. As autumn approached, their family had found a new equilibrium. Linda had moved into her cottage and was working part-time at the sanctuary while maintaining her own space and independence. Mark and Linda had learned to co-parent effectively while pursuing their shared mission of wildlife conservation. The sanctuary was gaining recognition in the wider wildlife rehabilitation community, with requests for advice and visits from other facilities. Tommy had become something of a local celebrity, with newspaper articles featuring his story and his work with injured animals. But the biggest change was in Tommy himself. The shy, anxious boy who had emerged from the hospital after their accident had grown into a confident young man with a clear sense of purpose. He talked about becoming a veterinarian someday, specializing in wildlife medicine. 3 years had passed since the accident that changed their lives forever. Tommy was now 11 years old and had become the heart and soul of Mountain View Wildlife Sanctuary. The facility had grown from a converted barn to a professional operation, with proper medical facilities, flight cages, and specialized enclosures. Mark stood in the new visitor center, watching Tommy give a presentation to a group of school children about wildlife conservation. His son spoke with confidence and passion. That amazed everyone who met him. The shy boy who once struggled to make friends now captivated audiences with stories about the animals they had helped. The most important thing to remember, Tommy told the children, is that wild animals belong in the wild. We only keep them long enough to help them get better. Then we let them go back where they belong. Linda watched from the back of the room, beaming with pride. She had found her calling in managing the sanctuary's educational programs and fundraising efforts. Her business background had helped turn their passion project into a sustainable operation that could support itself and help even more animals. The sanctuary now employed 3 full-time staff members besides the family, including Dr. Martinez, who had left private practice to become their head veterinarian. They had helped over 500 animals in the past 2 years, with a release rate that was among the highest in the region. But success had brought new challenges. The state wildlife department was pressuring them to expand their facilities to handle larger animals, including bears and elk. The federal government was considering designating their area as a critical wildlife corridor, which would bring more animals but also more regulations. "We need to talk about the future," Mark told Linda. That evening, as they walked through the sanctuary grounds, Tommy was ahead of them, checking on their current patients before bedtime, a routine he had maintained religiously for 3 years. "The Morrison Foundation wants to fund a major expansion," Linda said. "They're talking about enough money to build a full veterinary hospital and double our capacity." Mark nodded. He had been expecting this conversation. The Morrison Foundation was a major wildlife conservation organization that had been tracking their success. Their offer would transform the sanctuary into a regional center for wildlife rehabilitation. "But that changes everything," Mark continued. "We'd have to incorporate as a major nonprofit, bring in professional management, follow federal regulations. Tommy would grow up in a completely different environment." They had reached Max's grave under the old oak tree. Someone had left fresh flowers there, probably Tommy, who still visited regularly to tell his old friend about their latest rescues. "What does Tommy think?" Linda asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "He's excited about helping more animals, but I don't think he fully understands what it would mean," Mark replied. "He'd have less hands-on time with the patients, more time spent on education and fundraising. It might change the very thing that makes him love this work." The decision became more complicated when Dr. Martinez announced she was pregnant and considering a job offer from the university's veterinary school. Her departure would leave them without their most experienced medical staff, just when they were being asked to take on more complex cases. Tommy sensed the tension in the adults around him, though they tried to shield him from the business pressures. One evening he approached Mark while he was repairing a fence in the raccoon enclosure. "Dad, are we going to have to sell the sanctuary?" Tommy asked directly. Mark was surprised by the question. "What makes you think that, buddy?" "I heard you and Mom talking about changes in federal regulations," Tommy said. "And Dr. Martinez seems sad all the time now. Are we in trouble?" Mark sat down on a fence post and motioned for Tommy to join him. The boy was growing taller every month and would soon be as tall as his father. But in moments like this, he was still the scared child who had survived the accident that brought them all together. "We're not in trouble," Mark assured him. "But we have some big decisions to make about how the sanctuary grows. There are people who want to help us expand and help even more animals, but it would change how we operate." Tommy was quiet for a long moment, watching a family of rescued opossums play in their enclosure. "Would we still live here? Would you and Mom still work together?" "That would depend on the decisions we make," Mark answered honestly. "Some options would mean we stay exactly as we are. Others might mean big changes." "What do you think we should do?" Tommy asked. Mark was touched that his son wanted his opinion, but he also knew this decision would affect Tommy's entire future. "I think we should pray about it, and maybe visit some other sanctuaries to see how they operate. Then we can make the choice together, as a family." Over the next 6 months, they developed a comprehensive plan for the Mountain View Wildlife Network. The Morrison Foundation was intrigued by their proposal and agreed to fund the pilot program. Instead of one massive facility, they would establish 5 smaller sanctuaries across the region, each run by carefully selected families who shared their philosophy. Mark would oversee construction and facility design for each location, using his construction expertise to ensure proper enclosures and medical facilities. Linda would develop the educational programs and business training for each family. Tommy would help create a junior naturalist program that would involve local children in wildlife conservation. The first satellite sanctuary was established just 50 miles away, run by a retired park ranger and his wife who had been volunteering at Mountain View for 2 years. Their teenage son showed the same natural aptitude for animal care that Tommy possessed, and the two boys became close friends and collaborators. As the network grew, Tommy found himself traveling to different sanctuaries to help with difficult cases and train other young volunteers. He had developed a reputation for being able to calm even the most frightened animals, a skill that seemed almost supernatural to outside observers. "There's something special about that boy," the ranger's wife told Linda during one of Tommy's visits. "The animals respond to him differently than they do to the rest of us. It's like he speaks their language." Linda had noticed it too, but she had also seen how the responsibility sometimes weighed on her son. Tommy felt personally responsible for every animal that didn't survive, despite their high success rate. He was growing up faster than she would have liked, carrying burdens that most adults couldn't handle. One evening, as they sat together by Max's grave, Tommy shared something that had been troubling him. "Mom, do you think Max sent the mountain lion to teach me something?" Linda was surprised by the question. "What do you mean, honey?" "Luna was the hardest animal to let go," Tommy explained. "But she taught me that loving something means wanting what's best for it, even if that's not what you want for yourself. I think about that every time we release an animal now." Linda felt tears welling up in her eyes. Her 11-year-old son had learned a lesson about love and sacrifice that many adults never mastered. The accident that had nearly destroyed their family had somehow created this wise, compassionate person who was already making a difference in the world. "I think Max sent all of this," Linda said softly, gesturing toward the sanctuary buildings and the mountains beyond. "The accident, the rescue, meeting the Pattersons, even your father and me learning to work together again. I think he knew we all needed each other." Tommy nodded solemnly. He was a very smart dog. As autumn turned to winter, the Mountain View Wildlife Network had successfully established its first 3 satellite sanctuaries. Each was thriving in its own way, helping animals and educating communities about wildlife conservation. Tommy had found his calling not just in caring for individual animals, but in inspiring other young people to follow the same path. Mark and Linda had discovered that their failed marriage had somehow led to a stronger partnership than they had ever imagined. They worked together seamlessly now, combining their different strengths to build something larger than either could have accomplished alone. The boy who had almost died in a truck at the bottom of a mountain had become a beacon of hope for wildlife across the region. The single father who had felt like a failure was now recognized as an innovative leader in wildlife rehabilitation. The divorced couple who couldn't stand to be in the same room together had become partners in one of the most successful conservation programs in the state. As Tommy prepared for bed that night, he stopped by his window to look out at Max's oak tree. Snow was beginning to fall, covering the mountains in a blanket of white that reminded him of that terrible night in the truck. But instead of fear, he felt gratitude for the journey that had brought them to this moment. "Thank you, Max," he whispered into the darkness. "Thank you for saving us and bringing us home." The next month, they visited 3 different wildlife facilities in neighboring states. Each had taken a different approach to growth and expansion. One had become a major research center affiliated with a university. Another had maintained its small-scale, family-operated model. The third had found a middle ground, growing selectively while maintaining its personal touch. Tommy was fascinated by all of them, but Mark noticed his son was most comfortable at the smaller facility in Colorado. It was run by a couple similar to themselves, with their teenage daughter heavily involved in the daily operations. "They're like us," Tommy observed during the drive home. "They didn't lose what made them special when they got successful." Linda had been thinking the same thing. Maybe we don't have to choose between staying small and helping more animals. Maybe there's a way to grow that fits who we are. The solution came from an unexpected source. The Patterson, now settled in their retirement community, had been following the sanctuary's success with pride. Mr. Patterson had an idea during one of their weekly visits. "What if you didn't expand here, but helped other people start sanctuaries, like this one?" he suggested. You could share what you've learned and create a network of smaller facilities instead of one big one. The idea intrigued all of them. Instead of accepting the Morrison Foundation's offer to expand their facility, they could use the funding to help establish satellite sanctuaries throughout the region. Each would maintain the personal, family-centered approach that had made their work so successful. Tommy was immediately excited about the concept. We could help other kids learn to take care of wildlife like I did, and the animals wouldn't have to travel as far to get help. Dr. Martinez loved the idea too. Instead of leaving for the university, she could head up a training program that would teach veterinarians at each satellite facility. Her pregnancy wouldn't interfere with a role that involved less hands-on animal care and more education. 5 years later, Tommy was 16 and the Mountain View Wildlife Network had become a model for wildlife rehabilitation programs across the country. What had started as a desperate attempt to save 2 lives in a crashed truck had grown into a movement that was changing how people thought about wildlife conservation. Tommy stood at the podium of the National Wildlife Rehabilitation Conference, looking out at an audience of professional rehabilitators, veterinarians, and conservationists from around the world. At 16, he was the youngest person ever invited to deliver a keynote address at the prestigious event. The most important lesson I've learned, Tommy told the audience, is that every rescue is really about connection. When we save an animal, we're not just healing their body. We're rebuilding the bridge between humans and the natural world that we've somehow lost. In the audience, Mark and Linda sat together, both struggling not to cry with pride. Their son had grown into a poised, articulate young man who spoke with the authority of someone who had dedicated his life to a cause greater than himself. Dr. Martinez sat nearby with her 3-year-old daughter, who was already showing signs of inheriting her mother's love for animals. She had become one of the leading authorities on wildlife rehabilitation techniques, thanks largely to the innovative methods developed at Mountain View. The Pattersons were there too, now in their 80s, but still actively supporting the network they had helped create. Max's legacy lived on not just in the sanctuary that bore his name, but in the dozens of facilities that used their model of family-centered, community-based wildlife care. After Tommy's presentation, he was approached by representatives from several universities offering full scholarships for their veterinary programs. He had already been accepted to 3 different schools, but he wasn't sure he wanted to follow a traditional academic path. I've learned more from actually working with animals than I could ever learn in a classroom, Tommy told Mark and Linda that evening, as they walked through the original sanctuary grounds. Maybe there's a different way to get the knowledge I need. Mark understood his son's reluctance to leave the work he loved for years of studying. But he also knew that formal education would give Tommy credibility and skills that would help him make an even bigger impact. What if you could do both? Mark suggested. There are programs where you can work in the field while earning your degree. Dr. Martinez could probably help you design something that fits what you want to do. The solution came from an unexpected source. The Morrison Foundation, impressed with the success of their network model, offered to fund an experimental program that would allow Tommy to earn his veterinary degree while continuing his hands-on work with wildlife. The program would be based at the university but would involve rotations through different sanctuaries in their network. Tommy would spend part of his time in traditional classes and part working directly with animals, under the supervision of experienced professionals. It's never been done before, the foundation representative explained. But your work has already changed how we think about wildlife rehabilitation. Why not change how we train the next generation of wildlife veterinarians too? Tommy was excited about the opportunity, but he was also worried about leaving the sanctuary for extended periods. The facility had become his second home, and he felt responsible for the animals in their care. The sanctuary will still be here when you graduate, Linda assured him, and think about all the other sanctuaries in the network that could benefit from having you involved in their training programs. As Tommy prepared to start his unconventional veterinary education, remarkable changes were happening at the original Mountain View facility. They had been selected as the site for a major research project studying the psychological benefits of wildlife rehabilitation for trauma survivors. The study had grown out of observations about Tommy's own recovery from the accident. Researchers had noticed that children who participated in their educational programs showed significant improvements in anxiety, depression, and post-traumatic stress symptoms. There's something about caring for injured animals that helps people heal their own wounds, the lead researcher explained to Mark and Linda. Your son's story is just the beginning. We think this work could help thousands of trauma survivors. The research program brought new visitors to the sanctuary, including other families who had survived accidents or tragedies. Mark found himself counseling other single fathers who were struggling to connect with their children after divorce or loss. Linda developed support groups for parents whose children had been injured or traumatized. She drew on her own experience of nearly losing Tommy to help other families navigate the complex emotions that came with their child's recovery. One of the most moving cases involved a 7-year-old girl named Emma, whose family had been in a house fire. She had withdrawn completely after losing her pet cat in the blaze and refused to speak to anyone, including her parents. Tommy worked with Emma during one of his breaks from university, introducing her to an injured baby owl that had been brought to the sanctuary. Something about the owl's vulnerability connected with the girl's own trauma, and she began speaking for the first time in months. "The owl is scared like me," Emma whispered to Tommy as she gently stroked the bird's feathers. "But you're helping it get better." "We're helping each other get better," Tommy replied. "That's what happens here. We all help each other heal." Within weeks, Emma was volunteering regularly at the sanctuary, helping care for baby animals under careful supervision. Her parents were amazed at the transformation, and Emma's therapist documented significant improvements in all areas of her recovery. Stories like Emma's were becoming common at Mountain View and the other sanctuaries in their network. The facilities had evolved beyond wildlife rehabilitation into healing centers that helped both animals and humans recover from trauma. Tommy's university research project focused on documenting these therapeutic benefits and developing protocols that other facilities could use. His thesis, completed at age 20, was published in multiple veterinary and psychological journals and became required reading in wildlife rehabilitation programs. After graduation, Tommy faced another crossroads. He had job offers from zoos, research institutions, and government agencies around the world. But he also had an opportunity to return to Mountain View and lead the network's expansion into therapeutic wildlife programs. The decision was made easier when he met Sarah, a graduate student in psychology who had been working on the trauma research project. She shared his passion for using wildlife rehabilitation as a tool for healing human trauma, and they began collaborating on new programs that combined animal care with therapy. "This is where it all started," Tommy told his parents as they stood together by Max's grave on his graduation day. The oak tree had grown larger over the years, its branches providing shade for a new generation of rescued animals. Mark looked at his son, now a tall, confident young man with a veterinary degree and a clear vision for his future. It was hard to believe this was the same frightened boy he had held in that crashed truck so many years ago. Linda wiped tears from her eyes as she watched Tommy place a new stone at the base of Max's tree. Engraved on it was a simple message: "Max, guardian angel to all who need healing." The sanctuary that had started with one man's desperate attempt to save his son had grown into something none of them could have imagined. But at its heart, it remained what it had always been: a place where broken things could be made whole again, where love could triumph over trauma, and where the simple act of caring for others could transform lives. Tommy looked up at the mountains where their story had begun, then back at the bustling sanctuary where it continued to unfold. He was ready to spend his life ensuring that Max's legacy would live on, helping heal both animals and humans for generations to come. The miracle that had emerged from the wreckage of that mountain road continued to grow, touching lives around the world and proving that sometimes the most devastating moments can become the foundation for the most beautiful transformations.